everybody and welcome to week 5 of the Lexi Hoodie Sew Along. So this week is actually going to be week 5 and 6 combined. I decided as I was going that no one was going to want to wait another week to do their binding and finishing touches once they'd started putting together their hoodie. So I've popped it all into 1 week. So this is the final video and you will have everything that you need to construct and finish off your gorgeous hoodie. So as you can see, I'm wearing my hoodie now for this video. Actually, it's not a hoodie, and that's the whole point. I did the hoodless version, which was my goal to do as I was doing this sew along, to test out and make sure that it still went over the head and sat nicely, doing a hoodless version. So I have done that, and I thought I'd wear that for this video so you can get a bit of a closer up look, a bit of an idea of how it looks without a hood. I really love it and I'm really glad I did this. So maybe if you're making a hooded version this time, think about making a hoodless version later. It just gives a slightly different look and feel, which is really nice. So this video is a bumper video. It is a long one, a lot to get through. Please don't miss the little section that I have labelled on the video in the chapters as important. This is a step that a lot of people might decide to skip and not think is important, but it really is very important if you want everything to fit together nicely, if you don't want a stretched out neckline, etc., etc. Please make sure that you, if nothing else, refer to that step and make sure you do that step. But yes, get through it, enjoy the process of watching it come together, and I'll see you at the end of this video. Enjoy, guys. All of the sewing we're doing this week calls for a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimetre seam allowance. We want to continue using our walking foot, and unfortunately there is no guide for 3/8 of an inch on this. So you may want to do your own marking on your stitching plate to make this a lot easier. I recommend you grab a piece of coloured tape if you have it, and grab this and mark the place on your stitching plate where it's 3/8 of an inch. There should be some markings there already as a guide, but also after you've placed it, make sure that you check that this is correct. Pop your fabric under and line it up with your piece of tape, and then pop your needle into the down position. Grab a ruler if you have one handy, and just make sure that it's definitely a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once it is, you're all good to go, and just use that tape as your guide. If you want to taper the sleeve for the Lexi hoodie a little bit more, here's how to go about it. The most important thing is to make sure that we do not make any adjustments to the top armhole section of the sleeve. This needs to remain as it is in order for everything to fit together on your hoodie. What we can do, however, is change the side angles, as these are only going to be sewn together and does not affect any other part of the hoodie. In order to do this, what we need to do is mark the amount that we want to taper our sleeves in equally along both bottom edges. In this case, for my first test, I'm going to taper my sleeves in by approximately 1 inch on each side. Mark that 1 inch point on the bottom edge, and then take your ruler and rule a line from that top point of your sleeve cap down to your 1 inch marking. Make sure you do this on both sides of the sleeve. Once you've marked those lines, you can go ahead and cut the sleeve along those lines. This may be easiest to do with your rotary cutter, or you can do it with scissors as well. The main thing is to just make sure that we're not making any adjustments to that top sleeve cap area. This is the width of the sleeve made as per the pattern for a size extra large. Please do bear in mind though that I have added a row of squares to the end of my sleeve, and this does taper it a little bit more just by following the angle of the sleeve sides. But it gives you a good guide as to what you can expect for an extra large sleeve. If you're doing a size larger than an extra large, it may be a little bit wider due to the larger size. Here's the sleeve width after I've tapered it by 1 inch on each side. I find that this is a nice sleeve width, and I think I'm going to keep my sleeve like this for this prototype. Here's the sleeve tapered at 2 inches from both sides. Personally, I wouldn't taper this much as I feel that now this is a little bit tight and unbalanced to the roominess of the top half of the sleeve. So if you're doing extra large or smaller, I wouldn't recommend going this far. However, if you were doing a larger size, you may be able to taper this much as there is more room to play with. But go with your gut, and if unsure, you can always do a test sleeve to make sure. Now it's time to trace our pattern pieces onto our quilted fabric panels. I recommend for the bodice front and the bodice back that you line up the bottom edge with the bottom edge of your patchwork piecing. In this case, I have lined up the bottom edge with the second row of my piecing because I added an extra row to the bottom of my panel. Also ensure that the fold line on your pattern piece matches up evenly with the center seam on your patchwork panel. Weigh or pin the template piece in position and then trace along the outside edge. Once you've traced this side, flip the template over onto the other side of your panel, making sure you line up that center seam again. Trace this side and then repeat this for your other bodice piece. Now trace your sleeve templates onto your sleeve panels in the same way, ensuring that everything is central within your star. Also, as you're tracing, make sure you always transfer over those dot markings onto your fabric. I made my sleeve a bit longer, and if you do that, all you need to do is extend the angle of that line down to the bottom edge. Trace your hood sides template onto your hood sides panel, flipping the template for your second tracing. This ensures that we have two mirror image pieces. Also make sure that again you transfer all of the dot markings onto your fabric panel as you trace. And lastly, trace your hood gusset onto your hood gusset strip, making sure that you transfer all of those markings. Before you cut out any of your pattern pieces, please make sure that you complete this crucial step. This is what I think is one of the most important things to make sure you get the end result you're after. Sew a line of stitching inside every traced edge. I've done this approximately 1/4 of an inch inside of my trace lines. Do this consistently around every pattern piece. This is essential because A, your patchwork pieces may start to separate after you cut them, but B, it's more important to avoid any stretch, especially along curved edges. If you forget to do this step, you may find that your neckline will stretch and that your hood won't fit appropriately. You also might find the same with your armholes and other sections. This is due to the nature of curved seams and also due to the piecing that we have done. This stitching is like a stay stitch and it will just make sure that all of our edges stay sewn together but also stay the same size and shape that we want them to be so that everything will fit together and have the end result that we desire. Only once you've completed all of this stay stitching around all of your pattern pieces can you go ahead and start cutting them out. Cut them out as precisely as you can around your trace lines. Do this for all of your pieces so they are all ready to go, and then we can get stuck into sewing our hoodie together. Before getting stuck into sewing, let's cut our lining pieces out. Now to cut our lining pieces, we need to make sure that we are working with the grain line. The grain line of the fabric runs parallel to the selvage edge. So as you can see, I have the selvage edge at the bottom of the screen here. So I'm going to make sure that the grain line that's marked on the pattern pieces is in line with the grain line of the fabric. Take your fabric and fold it and then line up the fold line on your template piece with the fold in your fabric. Trace the template onto your fabric, making sure that you transfer all of those markings. Once that's all traced out, you can cut out your pieces. Once unfolded, you will have your full bodice front and bodice back pieces. Go ahead and trace and cut out all of your remaining lining pieces. If you trace and cut out your hood sides and your sleeve pieces on folded double fabric, you will naturally get two mirror image pieces. If you have made any alterations to any of the sections of your pattern, you may actually like to use your cut out main pieces as the template to trace and cut out your lining pieces. This will just ensure that every piece is exactly the same size and you'll get the end result that you're after with these alterations. Now let's start sewing together our hoodie. Take your bodice front and your bodice back and place these on top of each other, right sides together. First, we're going to be sewing together the shoulder seams. So start pinning these together, working from the outer shoulder edge in towards the neckline. You will find that the bodice front piece is ever so slightly longer than the bodice back piece. This is just within the seam allowances and is intentional so you get that nice curve once the two pieces are sewn together. So go ahead and pin together both shoulder edges, and once they're pinned in place, sew each of those together using your 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimetre seam allowance. Here they are sewn together. Now open up those seams and we're going to press those shoulder seams open. So go ahead and do that for both of your shoulders, and then we're ready for the next step. Now we're going to sew in one of our sleeves. So take your sewn together bodice pieces and lay these out right side up on your work surface. Then take one of your sleeves and make sure it is the correct one with the matching markings. The centre marking on your sleeve matches up with your shoulder seam, so pin that first. Then match up the single markings on the sleeve back and the double markings on the sleeve front. Once you have pinned together those important points, you can start easing in together the rest of the edges and pinning them together nice and neatly. You should find that your sleeve is the exact length to fit perfectly around your armhole. Once you're happy with the fit, go ahead and sew your sleeve into place. Once your sleeve is in place, we're now going to trim that seam allowance and take some snips into it to allow extra flexibility. So trim the seam allowance down to about 1/4 of an inch just to reduce the bulk a little bit, and then we're going to start snipping into that seam allowance. So please make sure you don't snip down as far as your stitching line. You're just doing small snips to increase the flexibility a little bit without compromising your seam, which we need to stay nice and strong. Once trimmed and snipped, press those seam allowances in towards the body pieces. Now rearrange your hoodie so that the inside sleeve edges are together and your body side edges. First, match up your underarm seams and pin these together so that they are nicely meeting. Then continue to pin along the inner sleeve and the body side edges. Once everything is neatly pinned together, go ahead and sew this seam, starting from the top of your sleeve and working all the way down the body side. Once those seams are all sewn together, we now want to press those open. These can be difficult to do without something like an ironing ham, or you might want to roll up an old towel or something like that to place inside the sleeve so that you can effectively press open those seam allowances. Once pressed, snip into the seam at the armpit a little bit, again being extremely careful not to snip any of your seams. Repeat all of these steps with your other sleeve and side of your hoodie, and then you can turn everything right side out. Now it's time for the hood. So take all of your hood pieces and again refer to the markings which will match on your gusset piece and your hood side pieces. Line up these markings and pin these spots together first, and then continue to pin the remainder of the curve together. You will need to ease this a little bit as you go to make sure you have a neat, even fit. Once you're happy with your pinning, go ahead and sew this seam. Once your first seam is sewn, go ahead and attach the other side of your hoodie gusset to your other hoodie piece in the same way. Then go ahead and sew this one together. Now you can go ahead and trim these seam allowances to reduce the bulk a little bit, and then take some snips, especially into that very curved edge at the back of the head. Then you can go ahead and turn your hood right side out, and now we have all of our main outer hoodie pieces ready to go. Repeat all of these steps with your lining pieces, and now you will have your main hoodie lining and your hood lining pieces all ready to go. For the remainder of our steps, we're going to be making use of bias binding. Now the easiest way to do this is go ahead and purchase pre-made bias binding like the one I'm showing here. This makes life a whole lot easier and you're all ready to go. If, however, you intend to make your own bias tape like I am, here are two methods to do that. Firstly, what you need to do is grab your bias fabric and cut it on the bias. So take your first strip on a 45-degree angle and cut that. Then continue to cut strips on the bias from the remainder of your fabric. I am cutting my strips at 1 inch and 7/8 to create 1 inch bias tape. Some people suggest cutting at 2 inch width, but I like that little bit of a gap between my two folded over edges. So cut all of your usable fabric into these strips. Once you have all of your pieces, we now need to attach these together to create one continuous length. So match up your edges, making sure the angle is the same, and then place these right sides together on top of each other. You do want the points to go out by about 1/4 inch so that when you sew with your seam allowance, you're going from corner to corner and creating a continuous length. You may want to mark that line in place before you go ahead and sew, just to ensure that everything is getting joined together nicely and evenly. Once you've sewn that together, snip off those little excess triangles at the edge and you should now have a continuous length. Continue to do this on every end. You may need to trim off selvage edges as you go. Once you have your full length, press your strips, including pressing open all of those seam allowances so they are sitting nice and flat. For the first method of putting together our bias tape, I'm showing you using a bias tape maker. This is definitely much easier than doing it manually. Go out and buy yourself a 1 inch or 25mm bias tape maker, and then we just thread one end through the bias tape tool, and then you want to continue threading it through, pressing as you go to secure all of those folds. Continue this along the whole length of each strip. The last method of creating our bias tape is to do it fully manually. To do this, grab your strip and fold it in half onto itself and press it in this halfway position. Next, take your raw edges of the length and press them into the centre to meet, just shy of the centre. Press these folds neatly into place all the way along and be very careful for your fingertips as you can get burnt very easily. But as you can see, much easier to do with the tool. Take your main hood piece and your hood lining. With the hood lining inside out, place this inside your right side out main hood. And now start matching up all of those seams and pinning the edges together. They are the exact same size pieces, so everything should fit together nicely and neatly. Please pin these together on your main fabric side rather than the lining side. This is just to avoid the lining side stretching as you sew so that your pieces fit perfectly together. Once fully pinned together, go ahead and machine tack with the patchwork side up all the way around all the edges using about a 1/4 inch seam. Now that the two layers of your hood are all secured together, we are going to bind the front edge of the hood. You want to make sure that we are not binding the neckline edge, but are binding this front edge shown now. The neckline edge, which I'm demonstrating now, is to remain unbound and is going to get sewn onto the hoodie later. Take your hood and a length of your bias tape to the sewing machine. We are going to sew the bias tape right sides together to the lining side of the front hood edge. What you want to do is sew along that first fold, or if that is more than 3/8 of an inch, please sew at 3/8 of an inch. Sew all the way along, right sides together. Once you get to the other end of your hood front edge, snip away the excess bias tape. Fold the bias tape over to the right side of your hood and refold it all in place so that you have the nice neat edge. Pin this in place all the way along your hood front edge. Once you're happy, we're now going to top stitch the edge of this bias tape into place on our main hood edge. To do this, sew really close to that nice neat folded edge, approximately 1/8 of an inch in or less, depending on your confidence. On this sweatshirt, I also decided to sew a second row of top stitching along the other edge, but this is just an option and personal preference. Let's sew that hood into place on our hoodie neckline. Take your hood and we're going to put this right sides together with our neckline. we want to look at those marks that we had marked earlier on the hood. Those marks meet up with the shoulder seam of your neckline. So meet those marks up first with the shoulder seams and pin them neatly into position. Then position the hood gusset to the centre back of your hoodie, making sure it is centrally placed. Pin that in position there, and then continue to pin the remaining edges together. When you get to the front centre piece, make sure that the centre edge meets up with your centre seam where the seam allowance rests. Once you know that is accurately positioned, pin it into place. Do the same with the other side of your hood once you get around to the other edge. They will be slightly overlapping so that once sewn together with the seam allowance, they will be perfectly abutting each other at that point. In order to keep everything nicely together when we sew all the layers together later, I also decided to pin down those front edges of the hood to the body just to keep everything neatly in place. Once you are happy, go ahead and sew all the way around the neckline. Once the hood is fully sewn in place, I now need you to turn the whole hoodie inside out so that we can get prepared to sew in the lining. Turn your hoodie lining right side out and make sure it is facing the same direction as your main hoodie. Now insert the hoodie lining inside your main hoodie and work its way up to the neckline. Your main hoodie and your lining should now be right sides together with the hood sandwiched in between the two layers. Meet up your side shoulder seams and pin these into place, making sure that you are pinning from the main hoodie side and not the lining side. Once those 2 points are pinned neatly together, you can go ahead and pin together all of the neckline edges. Make sure you do plenty of pins at very close increments to make sure everything is neatly and evenly together. Sew all the layers together all the way around the neckline. Once your neckline is fully sewn, go ahead and trim that seam allowance to reduce the bulk and snip into the curves. I'm not doing it here as I'm removing this hood to make my hoodless version, but do as we did with the other steps. Now turn your hoodie right side out, putting the lining inside the body, threading through the arms and getting everything evenly sitting on top of each other. Once you've done that, go ahead and press that neckline edge, making sure that the seam allowance is directed towards the body. If you want to, you could also choose to top stitch that in place. Here's a little pro tip for those doing the hoodless sweatshirt. Sometimes you'll find when you do bias binding on an inner curve such as the neckline, you'll get a bit of ruffling on your bias binding because the edge that the bias binding is sitting against is slightly shorter than where we're sewing it on, where the seam allowance is. There is a way that we can reduce this. Some people suggest to stretch the bias binding as you sew it, but this can also compound the issue by stretching the whole bias binding and making it even more prone to ruffling. So one thing that we can do is actually train the bias binding to sit flat in the curve in the way that we would like it. In order to do this, first grab your bias binding and fold it in half so that it's sitting the way it will sit once it's on your finished garment. Press the bias binding into this folded position. Please make sure you are not stretching the bias binding in this process. You are simply pressing that fold into place all the way along the length. Now we can start manipulating the bias binding. You can do this just manually if you like by grabbing your bias binding and placing it in the curved shape the way it will sit once it is sewn onto your neckline. Once you feel that it's curved appropriately and similarly to what the neckline will be, you can go ahead and use a hot steam iron to press the binding and train it into this position. In this case, however, we don't need to guess as we actually have the templates available to us. So grab your bodice front template and start working at the middle of a section of bias binding that is long enough to go around your whole neckline plus overlap. Start at that centre position and position that onto your bodice front neckline from one side. Once it is sitting nicely around the curve of the neckline, press the bias binding to train it into this curved position. Make sure that the paper is right up against that folded edge that we just pressed previously. Once you've done one side, you can flip over your template, and where you started, go ahead and do the same in the opposite direction for the other side of the bodice front neckline. Get that nicely sitting around that curve, and then once it's nicely sitting into position, again press with that hot steam iron to train the bias binding to sit in that position. Basically what we're doing is training it to be a little bit stretched around those open edges only, so that therefore everything will sit nicely once it's all sewn together, given the different lengths. Once you've done these, you can then go ahead, if you also wish to, and get your bodice back pieces and continue to train it in the same way around those paper pieces. The back does have a little bit less of a curve, so you could just continue as I'm doing here, placing it into a nice curved position and pressing it as you go to train it into that slightly stretched edge. Once you've done this, you can go ahead to all the future steps to sew your binding into place around the neckline. One thing to remember is do not stretch as you are sewing this onto your neckline now. We have already trained it the way we want it to be, so you need to just sew it on nice and neatly without any stretch. You will find that doing this small step before you sew on your neckline bias binding will reduce ruffling so much, and you'll be so much more pleased with the end result. For those of you who are not adding a hood, let's get that neckline sewn together. Grab your lining and make sure it's inside out. Insert this inside your right side out main sweatshirt and line up the necklines together. First, match up those shoulder seams and pin them into place there. Once you have both shoulder seams neatly pinned together, you can then go ahead and pin together all the other edges. Make sure you are pinning these together from the main fabric side, not the lining side. We need to sew with this side up to ensure that we do not stretch the lining fabric as we sew around. Once these edges are fully pinned together, go ahead and machine tack around those edges with around a 1/4 inch seam. Once those two necklines are secured together, go ahead and thread your lining sleeves through your main sleeves and make sure both the lining and main layers are sitting evenly and neatly together. Take a length of your bias tape that is long enough to go around your neckline. We are now going to start sewing this into place. Just secure the starting point of where we're going to begin our stitching. Make this about 3 to 4 inches from one bias tape end and pin this in place on the lining side of your hoodie back. Take your sweatshirt to the sewing machine, and we are now going to start sewing the binding into place on the lining side of the neckline. Start your stitching where you pinned and sew around along that first fold in your bias tape. If that first fold is further than 3/8 of an inch from the edge, please sew with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Continue sewing around, evening and flattening out the fabric as you go to make sure you don't create any puckers. Sew around to the other side of your sweatshirt back until you have probably around a 6-inch gap between where you started sewing and where you end sewing. At that point, secure your stitches. Now here I lived a little bit dangerously and used a length of bias tape that wasn't quite long enough. So it's a bit of a case of do as I say, not as I do. You will hopefully have 2 ends of bias tape here with much more overlap than I do. Lay them against the remaining edges of the neckline and then mark where they overlap by 1/2 inch. Trim these ends straight so that you keep that 1/2 inch overlap. Make sure you're doing these trimmings of the 2 ends in the middle section of that gap so that you have easy access to both loose ends. Now place those loose ends on top of each other, right sides together, and pin them in place. We're going to sew these 2 ends together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That will eat up the 1/2 inch overlap we had, so that once it's all open out, it will evenly cover the remaining section of our neckline. Open out that seam allowance and finger press it in the open position, or take it to your iron to press that more securely in place. Now just pin the remaining edge of the bias tape along the neckline edge and then sew that open section in place following the line of stitching that we were doing previously. Now fold the bias tape over to the right side of your neckline and start clipping or pinning this in place. Make sure that the raw edge is neatly tucked in along that fold and that everything is looking neat as per the video. Pin it or clip it at regular intervals to make sure everything stays together nicely and evenly for when we go to sew this down. Once you have clipped or pinned everything together, make sure that you're really happy with it, as you can keep adjusting until everything is nice and even. Unfortunately, this is where my videographer skills went a little bit pear-shaped. You'll see in a moment where I try to zoom in the video, and unfortunately in the process I somehow also turned off the recording mode and only realised now that it didn't tape as I'm putting everything together. So I've taken a really quick video here of the finished product so you can see what I've done. What you need to do is top stitch the loose edge of the binding down in place along your whole neckline. As you can see, I've also stitched a second line of stitches really close to the edge. This is just as a decorative choice and will reduce any ruffling even more. You will also get a more visual example of this in the next section of video doing the sleeve. Take one of your hoodie sleeves and make sure that the lining and outer layers are evenly matched up together, with the seam also lined up on top of each other. Quickly machine tack all around the edge just to make sure that the layers stay together neatly and evenly. Take a length of your bias tape and trim off one end to neaten. Now open up your folds and then press the end in by about 1/4 inch. Finger press or press this with your iron. Now take your sleeve and line the edge of your bias tape up with the lining side of your sleeve. Pin that folded edge in place to secure as the starting point of your stitching. Now start stitching the bias tape into place on the lining of your sleeve end. Sew this in place along that first fold, or if your fold is further than 3/8 of an inch from the edge, a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Sew all the way around until you get up to your folded end again. Once you get up to the folded end, all you need to do is continue sewing over that folded edge by about 1/2 inch. Once you've overlapped by about 1/2 inch, secure your stitches and cut off the remaining raw end. Fold the bias tape over to the right side of your sleeve, folding everything nice and neatly back into place. Now clip the bias tape all the way around the edge, neatly and evenly. When you get up to your overlapped ends, all you need to do is open it up, join the folds and then fold it back over so that everything looks nice and neat. You may want to adjust this and pin it neatly in place very closely with clips or pins so that you can make sure you sew this together nicely and neatly. Now it's time to top stitch the binding into place. Do this by sewing really close to the loose edge. I like to do this by about 1/8 of an inch from the edge, or even closer if you feel confident. Sew all the way around and secure the binding in place. You'll see I also decided to do a second row of stitching right at the edge of the sleeve. This is just a decorative decision that I made, seeing as I am using a plain fabric for my binding. I just tried on my hoodie and decided in the end I actually don't want that extra row of squares that I added during the process. So I thought this was good to come and give you an example of what to do if you want to shorten the length of the body of your hoodie or your sleeve length. It's really important that we make sure that the main fabric and the lining remain at the exact same length so that everything's going to sit together nicely. In order to do this, I didn't want to just go randomly cutting. What I decided to do was to pin the two layers together along the bottom edge, and once everything was flat and neat, also pin together where I want to shorten the body to. Now I'm going to machine tack all the way around just inside where I intend to cut off the end of my body. Okay, so I have machine tacked that all the way around, so now I feel safe to trim the whole piece outside of my stitched line. But again, I don't want to risk doing this with a rotary cutter or doing it freehand, so I'm going to grab a ruler and rule a line exactly where I want to be cutting. In my case, I have done that approximately 3/8 of an inch outside that seam, so I know the binding will evenly cover that seam and neaten off that end for me. So rule that line all the way around, and only once that's neatly and evenly positioned, go ahead and cut all the way around. Those tacking stitches that we did earlier are keeping those ends nicely together, and everything's ready for binding. Now you can go ahead and bind the bottom edge of your sweatshirt. Join your ends using whichever method you prefer from the examples we've already gone over. Sew that all into place, and then you will have your completed sweatshirt. Woohoo, it's done. Can you believe it? You've actually finished off your Lexi hoodie, and I hope that you've tried it on, that you've strutted your stuff, that you've shown it off to everybody in your family and sent pictures to all your friends. I hope you love it. I hope you wear it with pride. I hope it keeps you warm and snuggly, and I hope you've enjoyed the process of making it. I also hope that you've enjoyed this sew along. I hope that it's been helpful for you. And I hope that you've just enjoyed the journey of doing it with a little bit more support and a great community of people who are all going through the same journey. So thanks, guys, for following along. Thanks for being a part of my first sew along. And yeah, wear your hoodie with pride. Please show it off to me on the Facebook group. I would love to see it. I really, really would. All the best, guys. Really enjoy your hoodie. See ya.